Today's webinar is about to tilt or not to tilt. Over the past maybe 6 or 8 months, a lot of my friends started investing in tilt shift lenses. I own 3 of them myself. I love them. I would never go without them. And I started seeing more and more people, whether they may not have actually been investing in them, they were expressing strong interest in tilt shift lenses. Now, with Canons, the designation of a Canon tilt shift lens is TS-E, and the TS stands for tilt shift. Nikon is PC-E, and I believe the PC stands for perspective control. And that's what it does. But before we go into the whole lesson of this webinar, I just want to give you a little background. I thought about it. You know, there are 2 reasons why you would want to buy a tilt shift lens. The first being to shift, or to actually correct your perspective, and the other is to tilt, or to change your plane of focus. And that's what I wanted to illustrate this, because I don't know how many people are necessarily familiar with tilt shift lenses. There's this great website here called thedigitalpicture.com, and you can see the URL. It's www.the-digital-picture.com. If you're ever looking for a review of just about any lens, especially Canon lenses and Nikon lenses, this site is the best. It's a bit cerebral. It's very heady. You get some pretty in-depth technical reviews, and I like it because, for the purposes of this particular webinar, it does a really nice job of allowing me to illustrate what tilting and shifting does. So think about it like this. Picture the camera is mounted onto your lens right here, and you have a sensor which is vertical. Now right here, the front element, this lens is not tilted or shifted. The entire front element is parallel to the sensor, which means you will get a flat depth of field. You'll get your standard depth of field from front to back. Now what happens with tilting is you actually tilt the lens. So now I'm tilting down at a negative angle, and now I can also tilt up. This, just for purposes, is the Canon 24mm Mark II tilt shift lens. When you tilt up, say, all the way, what's happening is now only the lower portion of your lens of the front element is actually somewhat parallel to your sensor. And as you tilt the lens upward, the rest of the plane goes out of focus. What this gives you is this kind of gradual out of focus look. And depending on whether the lens is tilted up, the lower portion of your frame will be in focus. And reciprocally, if the lens is down, the upper portion of your frame will be in focus. This helps achieve that kind of miniature toy model look. And the longer the focal length of the tilt shift lens, the more it's pronounced. So what I mean by that is Canon makes 4 tilt shift lenses. Nikon makes 3, I believe. So with Canon, you've got a 17mm, a 24mm, 45mm, and 90mm tilt shift lens. As you go longer towards the 45 and 90mm range, that miniaturized look is much more pronounced, and it's usually most effective when you have a higher plane or a higher position over the scene. So usually I'll try to be 10 to 12 feet at least, if not higher, above my subject when I want to kind of get that miniature look. So that's tilting, and also you can also tilt left to right. You can see here how it's parallel to the actual axis of this shift. Now, to explain what shifting is, let me just reset everything. Shifting is where you're actually physically shifting the lens up and down. It's still parallel to the sensor, but you're actually adjusting your perspective. So you're increasing the amount of basically the amount of room in the viewfinder in relation to the mirror and to your sensor. And what this allows you to do is get kind of rectilinear lines. Your lines will become straight. And so this is kind of what I wanted to illustrate to you, shifting and tilting, so you have an idea of the 2. Now, before we start the practice of imitating the tilt look, I want to show you quickly, we're going to go now into Lightroom. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're just going to stick with Lightroom, and we'll go into Photoshop just to launch FocalPoint. FocalPoint will pretty much be used the entire time. I'm not going to do any stylization really in the image. To explain that what shifting is, you can see here, this is just a park near my house, and there's this nice tree over here, and it's straight. It's nice. This was taken with a 24mm tilt shift lens. You can see it right here in the EXIF with my 5D Mark II. And I shifted it to straighten this lens. Now, to illustrate what the image would look like if you shot it without shifting, or if you shot it, say, with a Canon 24, the regular 24 prime, or the Canon 24-70, or the 70-200, or the 17-40, or the 16-35. Basically, if you shot this at 24mm without shifting, the image would look like this. So you see the difference between the two. This is, you basically have this distortion at 24mm. Shifting allows you to straighten that out. Now, with that being said, there are some tools that Lightroom and Photoshop have. I don't know how well they work. I'm actually going to try it live right now. But you do have in Lightroom this kind of lens correction. And if we adjust the vertical, we can almost kind of get the image straight. And so I haven't tried this before. I just want to see what it looks like. And it's actually not terrible. We're getting close. Now, it comes at a sacrifice to a portion of our original composition, which we can automatically crop down by checking that box. Yeah. And so, in a way, without having to go out, the 24mm tilt shift lens for Canon costs, I believe, $2,100. The 17mm is $2,500. The 45, I think, is about $1,600. So these are not cheap lenses. These are very niche lenses, primarily used for architecture. And because I shoot primarily architecture, they really fit nicely in my own lens arsenal. But if you're looking to get either correct your image for straight lines or to get the tilt shift lens, you can see here we were able to kind of mimic the look of a shift just by using Lightroom. Now, they have the same tools here in Photoshop as well. There is lens correction. So if you use either of those systems, you can kind of achieve that look. So right there, we can kind of turn that off and restore it back. Excuse me. And see the difference between the two. So let's go back, actually. Actually, you know what I want to do? I'm going to quickly readjust that. I want to compare the two just to show you. So you can see, other than the actual crop that we had to do, it's somewhat similar, and we can tweak it even more, but it's pretty convincing when you look at it, the difference between the two. So again, software is really good these days, and if you try to think forward when you're shooting and give yourself a little bit of room in your composition to crop down and straighten, you can kind of save yourself some money. So with that, let's go to the next with this image here. So this is the same image, and the only thing that I did was I tilted my lens to the right, which rendered the left portion of this image in focus, and it kind of dropped the right portion of the frame out of focus. The problem with tilt shift lenses, especially with tilting, is a lot of times, because you're kind of moving the front element away from being parallel to your sensor, you lose some sharpness. And so you can see, if we zoom in, the tree is really not very tack sharp. It's kind of a little soft, and we can kind of address this with sharpening. But let's zoom out and go to the original image here. Now, this is the shifted image, but it's not tilted. It's the front element is head on to your sensor. So now let's use FocalPoint, and this is what we're going to do for the rest of the exercises. We're going to go through different images and use FocalPoint to kind of mimic the look. So if we go to Photos, and I'm just going to send it to Photoshop. I prefer using Photoshop to access our products, but you can access them through Lightroom or Aperture as well. We're going to actually just recreate that look, and I'll show you how easy it is. Part of the reason why I came up with this webinar series is to kind of teach people how to look, how to see the scene to where this tilt look will benefit you. You have to have a methodology, you have to have a reason for tilting. You don't want to just blindly tilt because, one, obviously it's a very artificial look, but in a way, to that point, it also is very stylistic. It helps draw the eye through the frame and if it's used effectively. So to give you a quick primer of FocalPoint, at the heart of FocalPoint is this focus bug. It's this little critter right here, and by tugging at its legs, you can adjust the size and the shape, and you can also change its angle just by dragging it around. These antennas, which are marked by these hollow circles, adjust certain sliders here. So on the left here is your vignette. So in and out increases the intensity, and left to right increases the midpoint. And then the right here is the actual amount of blur and the feathering. Now, I don't use the antennas. I like using the actual sliders. To me, it's just an easier control. And you'll notice that the body of the bug by default is round. And what I did when I first came in here, just to let you know, is I went to edit and reset all. I'm going to do that for every image because it'll reset everything to default. So the first thing I want to do is I know that I want to maintain kind of a starting the depth of field to be sharp over here and render out of focus as we go to the right. What I can do is change the shape of the bug to planar, and now you'll see that the bug is square or planar, and I can adjust the shape and the size again just by tugging at the legs. Anything that is inside the confine of the bug, so anything inside the outer lines will remain in focus, and anything outside will go out of focus. You can control the transition by adjusting the feathering. So if you bring your feathering to 0, you'll see that there's a hard line now. There is no transition. I don't ever see a reason for doing that. And if you do it at 100, there'll be almost no transition at all, and you can see that by clicking on the mask here. I hit the show mask button under the focus brush panel, and you can see we really don't have much of a transition. Almost everything is out of focus. So the first thing I do is I'll just kind of find a nice mid-range for my feather, and I'll adjust the focus. Now, the amount will determine just how much of the blur will be applied. And you can see that we don't really even need that much to get a good look. You don't want to just blow it wide out and out of focus. You want to kind of retain some focus. You want to let the viewer know that there are trees over here. To increase a little bit of the depth and the texture of the background, I'm going to increase the optical quality slider here. And now we're starting to get some shape. We're starting to get an idea of what is in the background. You can also just, on the fly, readjust. So if you want this area here to be in focus, you can either extend the size of this bug, or you can use this brush over here. And if you're familiar with photo tools, you'll know that I use this brush all the time. It's a masking brush. The difference between photo tools and FocalPoint is this brush now will actually paint in or paint out focus as opposed to an effect. So I can just draw in right over here, and I can restore focus onto the tree. I just want to kind of over here. I don't necessarily want to go too crazy. And now we're starting to get somewhere. To further draw the eye to this portion of the frame, what I can do is I'm actually going to drop the amount even less. I'm really wanting a very, very gradual transition in the grass over here. I don't want it to be too apparent. And I can even do that. I can increase this transition by dropping the opacity of the brush and just kind of quickly giving a once over here, just to restore a tiny bit of focus. To further accentuate the focus towards the left, I can drop the brightness as well. And it's really only going to affect the areas that are out of focus, and I can boost the contrast. And so now we're getting somewhere. I see here there's too much of a transition here, so I'm going to reset the mask. I wasn't happy with that, and I can just paint it back in over here. And this is actually, if anything, this is as good of an insight to how I work on a daily basis. I'll make a change. If I don't like something, I start over. And so you can see now, as we drop the brightness and boost the contrast, we're getting a nice kind of gradual shift to this tree here. And in post-processing, I can actually brighten the tree to further draw the eye to it. But what I want to use FocalPoint for is to address all the areas that are out of focus. So that's one example here, and I have it saved here. I'm going to cancel out so that we don't spend time watching FocalPoint process. But let's go into Lightroom here, and here is the image tilted using a tilt shift lens. And then here is the image just using focal point. So you can see, let's zoom in over here. The image is much, much sharper and over here with if there's one major advantage of doing your tilting, as it were, in post-processing, is that I know that I can come to this is my original image here. I know that this will be tack sharp. If I go to this image over here, I've lost sharpness. And to me, that's one of the most important aspects of a photo, is to maintain sharpness at your focal point. It has to be tack sharp. So you can see I just switched from one image to the other. The difference, you have the effect. We've used focal point to achieve the effect, but we have the best of both worlds, if anything. We've got a tilted look, plus we've got a nice tack sharp image over here, and that's what's important to me. So let's move on. Let's choose this image right here. So this image was taken, and this image is to illustrate kind of that toy model look that I was telling you about, the miniaturized world look. This was taken in the Boston Garden, and this is this kind of like what is it called, the Swan Pond or something? I can't remember what it's called, but they have these cool little tours where you sit on these little swan boats, and you during the summer they just kind of shuttle you around. But in the winter, when the water freezes over, people ice skate, and it's actually really pretty and a lot of fun. So I took a shot here, just a reference shot, where the image was shifted, so I have straight lines, but I didn't do any tilting. Now, this is the image tilted. So I actually took the lens and I tilted it upward so the lower portion of the frame is in focus. And you can see it kind of does take this. They look like little models, like little toys that I placed down. If you zoom in, you can kind of see they just look like these little figurines. And it's a very appealing look. Now, back to my point, I was actually standing on a bridge overlooking them. There's a little pedestrian walkway that goes right over this pond. And so by being above them, I was able to accentuate that miniaturized look. And if I could have gone even higher, it would have been even more effective. So let's go take this image here, and I'm going to bring it into focal point again. And I'll show you what you can do to your focus bug to get that miniature look. So, and just for purposes of showing you this palette here, I try to make it a point to explain it. I access all of our applications using our onOne palette. If you have Photoshop and you installed our apps and you don't know where this palette is, just go to Window, Extensions, and select onOne, and it'll just pop up. If you want, you can also go to File, Automate, and then you'll see our products over here. So you can go to FocalPoint 2 and launch it as well. All right, like I said, we're going to go to Edit, Reset All to bring everything back. So all of our sliders came back and our focus bug was restored to its round shape. Now obviously we're going to want to change it to a planar shape and change the orientation so that it covers the point of the image that we want to retain focus on. In this case, it's going to be the pond and the people. Now, what you may not know is you can change the directionality of the blur. Right now, the blur is just kind of going up and down or left and right. If you hold the Option key or the Alt key on the PC while clicking inside the body of the bug, you'll notice that we're changing. You can see kind of it turns it into a 3D look. We're changing the directionality of the blur, and that kind of will accentuate the miniaturized look. Now, if you want, you can get tighter with the size of your bug, and again, you can start playing with your feathering. So if you want less of a feathering, you can do that. And I also will just drop the blur just a little bit. I don't want that much blur. So we're starting to take shape here. You can see now it's looking like toy models. And if we just toggle a preview, it's funny what a little bit of blur can do, because it doesn't look as apparent when the blur is removed. But when you add the blur and you kind of look away and then look back at the image and focus on the people, they do really start taking on that same miniaturized look. And you have $2,500 in your wallet or your bank account still. So it's pretty cool there. Now, I always still, there are a few things that I'll do in FocalPoint, like I did before, where I'll drop the brightness and I'll boost the contrast. I do this pretty much every time. I think FocalPoint does a really nice job in the out of focus areas when you play around with the brightness and contrast. I can also, I have this highlight bloom slider, and this is an awesome slider to use if you have specular highlights. So we don't have too many specular highlights here, but a specular highlight is basically anything, a light source that it appears, say, especially in an out of focus area, like if you're shooting indoors or you're shooting at night on the street lamps and little light sources will kind of take on these little light dot looks, and you can actually boost the appearance just by increasing the highlight bloom. And you can see like these are little specular highlights, these little street lamps. And if you want, you can go crazy with them. Um, what's cool is if you focus, you see all these little highlights appear and they look kind of like diamonds. You can control the shape of those. Basically, this is the shape of your aperture. It's the light passing through your aperture. And what your aperture is, it's the hole that appears when and I'm sorry if I'm getting too technical, but I just want to make sure that you understand. When your lens is comprised of blades, the blades close to a certain diameter. That's your aperture. Depending on the number of blades and the quality of blades, it will give you a different type of look. Now you can adjust the shape of that look. You can make it round, and it'll actually make the shape of your specular highlights round. You can also increase the number of blades to make it smoother. The more blades you have, the smoother your aperture. And this is typically something, whoops, this is typically something that you'll see more with more expensive lenses. The quality and the number of blades in your aperture go way up. So you can see, I actually want to make it perfectly round. What's fun, if you want to get funky, is a lot of times go to three-sided, and that gives you a triangle. And so you get these kind of upside-down triangles. You can adjust the rotation of them. So you can have a lot of fun with this. It's almost like with Lens Babies. Lens Babies give you these little templates for aperture where you can actually cut out a shape. Right now we only have triangles, but it's kind of fun. Or you could do squares. And it can give your image kind of a unique look, especially if your image is comprised of a lot of geometric shapes. Sometimes adding a square can accentuate that when you have specular highlights. So, I'm hoping this gives you ideas of how you can use FocalPoint. So let's go back. Let's drop out of here for a second, and we'll just see again. Let's close out of Photoshop, and we'll go into Lightroom. So this is, again, our image that we tilted our lens upward, and this is our image with FocalPoint. I personally find it hard to see a noticeable difference between the two. And I know that because I shot the image head-on without any tilt, that the portion of the image that's in focus is truly tack sharp. So that to me is worth its weight in gold. Now, let's move on. Here we have an image that I took on Old Orchard Beach. And this is a pretty straightforward one, but this is one of the main reasons why people tilt, is they want to kind of isolate a particular object in a portion of a frame. So in this situation here, it was just a nice flat beach. The sand was unadulterated, and I saw a shell that I grabbed and I put right here. And I liked the way the sun was angled because I got this cool little shadow over here. So I shot it head on. This is the same 24, oh, actually this is my 17mm tilt shift lens. And then I tilted it upward. And you can see the difference between the two. Here's the original, and here's with the lens tilted. So let's actually go into FocalPoint, and I bet if you guys were using FocalPoint right now with this image, I have a good feeling that most of you would be able to recreate this pretty quickly based on the examples that we just did. And I'll show you just how easy it is. Go into FocalPoint, reset everything. Now, I'm going to try something here. I want to have a little fun with this. I learned one of our master photographers on the onOne Master Program, who I think actually might be on this webinar, Scott Stolberg. He uses FocalPoint a lot, and he kind of turned me on to this effect, and I don't know how well it'll work with this image, but if you use a round shape, and let's boost up feathering to 100%, what that'll do is it'll make a really nice transition. If we drop our focus just a little bit and paint in, I want to just see something. We'll go into the actual effect in a second. I don't know if this is working as much as I want. It kind of is in a way, and I can actually paint out focus right around here. But you can almost start to see what it's going to do is it's going to make the shell float. It almost looks like it kind of is sitting on top of the sand, almost floating on top of it, and it kind of gives it a cool little effect. Now I would spend more time kind of making sure that the mask that I just drew around the shell blends in with the rest of the frame, but let's just go ahead and I'll show you the original practice that I wanted to do. We'll change our shape of our bug to, let me reset the mask to, there we go. We'll change the shape of our bug to planar and just drop it down right here. And again, what we want to do is we want to use the Option or Alt key while clicking inside the body of the bug to change the directionality of the blur. Now we're starting to get a nice transition. We can drop the amount. We don't need that much because I want to show you that there is, the surf in the back and nice little ocean area. We get it to the point where we're happy. We can boost up the optical quality. There really isn't much in terms of specular highlights in the background, so I'm not going to touch the bloom. But I can see if I click on the Show Mask button, I actually want this bottom portion in focus. So by selecting my focus brush and changing to Paint Focus, I can just fill it in very quickly. Let's hide the mask. And now we've got this nice kind of transition from in focus to out of focus. And it represents the exact same effect that you would have if you had a tilt shift lens and you tilted it upward so that the lower portion of your frame or the lens would be parallel to your sensor. You'd have this part in focus and the rest of it would go out of focus. What we can do is, again, to accentuate or stylize, we can drop the brightness and boost the contrast, and now we're starting to get a really nice look to the image. We also have in FocalPoint a vignette tool, and a vignette tool is a very classic tool to burn or to darken the edges of your image of the frame to kind of draw the eye to the center or to a particular focal point. By default, you can see we have this option here that says Vignette follows focus bug. And so you can see if we drop it down, just for illustrative purposes, it's actually, my focus bug is right around here. I can also drop the midpoint. If we deselect it, now it's actually doing what you would normally expect a vignette to do, and it would actually go to the edges. So I don't need that much, just a tiny bit will work. But you can see the difference if we deselect the image here. Here's our original image. And then here is our after image. And it actually adds a really nice effect to the image. And I was saying earlier, one of them, if I can have you guys walk away with one thing, it's how to start seeing if you do want to get this look or this style, you have to be methodical about it. It's not random. Like I said, I took a shell that was somewhere a few feet away and I positioned it specifically over here. I could have put it anywhere else in the frame, but I wanted it specifically on the lower third of the frame and in the center, because I knew that if I tilted my lens up, I would get this effect. So now what you guys can do with any lens that you have, it doesn't have to be a tilt shift lens, you can go out and you can start creating and composing scenes where tilting is appropriate, where you can actually use the style to your advantage. So let's cancel out and show you again what we did. Here's the original image, and then here's the image tilted, and then here's the image with focal point. So again, tilted, focal point. Now, I could have matched that amount of blur very, very easily. It's just a matter of increasing the blur amount, but I didn't eyeball it correctly. Still, notice the transition is identical. It's really, really, it does really true to form recreations of tilting a lens. So let's go on. We'll do another image here. Here's another good example of it's the same. This will be the same practice in terms of how we're going to tilt, but I want to show you the difference between sharpness. So look at the image here. I wanted the focus to be on these awesome the roots of the tree. You can see there's a lot of character to it, and it acts as a nice leading line towards the background or towards the foreground, depending on where your eyes start. But unfortunately, we've lost sharpness. There is just a lack of detail, and all I did was I tilted my lens upward. And here's our original image. So let's see if we have more sharpness here. We'll wait for the preview to load. And we definitely have more sharpness. So if there's one main point that I want to make is, or at least the advantage of using FocalPoint to tilt in post-processing, it's you can ensure that you have tack sharp focusing. So if we go into FocalPoint, I'll show you it's really, and in fact the results so far seem to be as good if not better than tilting. Now this upsets me because I've invested a lot of money in tilt shift lenses and I'm not going to sell them anytime soon, but you know, it would be great to have known that if I was really only interested in tilting, it would have been great, you know, 2 years ago when I started investing in these lenses, that I had this option. But, you know, hindsight's always 20/20. So here, I'm not even going to reset it because I did the exact same thing that I would do with that seashell shot. I'm just going to position the masking bug right over here, and if I want, I can show my mask, and I want this lower portion in focus, so I'm just going to paint that in right now. And when we hide it, now it'll be in focus. And you have this nice transition from your foreground to your background. And if you want to have more of this area in focus, just drop the amount. Sometimes as little as like 2 or 3% does just enough of a job so you get that tilt shift look. It doesn't have to be, you know, anything above 10%. And drop the contrast a little bit because we're getting a little bit of a hot spots in the building. So, you know, I'm hoping that a lot of this sinks in, that you're getting an idea of what FocalPoint can do for you, that it's not really a gimmick. Tilt shift lenses have a significant appeal. If someone were to ask me, all right, well, why at this point after seeing this webinar would I want a tilt shift lens? I would say if you're looking more to shift, if you're looking more to straighten your images out, you cannot beat a tilt shift lens because you get straight lines, but you also maintain your original composition. If you remember with our original example when I used Lightroom to correct the vertical line of the tree, we had to crop our original composition. And a lot of times if you're doing architecture photography, that's a no-no. You really don't have room. So it's much easier in camera to straighten your lines using the shift of the lens as opposed to using it in post-processing. So if you're very serious, if you know you're doing this commercially where you really need straight lines for architecture, first of all, odds are you already have the tilt shift lenses, but that would be my argument for the benefit of tilt shifting. To drive the point home, and this I'm being totally honest, if Canon made shift lenses only, where all I did was shift and I didn't tilt, I would buy those because I really don't use the tilt very much anymore. The sad thing is, guys, I've had way too many images here. Let me go to this example. When I first got my tilt shift lenses, I went tilt happy. I was nuts about tilting. I tilted everything. And I have, unfortunately, so many images in my Lightroom catalogs from the past about 2 years where you would never see these images. I would never work on them because they're not salvageable. This to me is not a usable image. There's just too much loss of sharpness. Even if I was going to post it on the website at a smaller resolution, I don't care because I want to make sure that my images are tack sharp. And sadly, because I tilted everything in camera, a lot of the images are not salvageable. So again, I learned from it, and I started using FocalPoint to my advantage whenever I want to get an isolated look. So let's work on one more image here. Actually, none of the other ones are pretty much the same example. So what I'll do is I'll start going to the questions here. I want to see if there are any good questions that we'll address right now, and then we'll go through the end of the webinar. There was a question here about whether I shoot JPEG or RAW. For purposes of the webinar, I always shoot, or for the purposes of the webinar, I'll convert my images to JPEG because they speed things up. But whenever I shoot for production or for HDR, say, it's always RAW. When I import into Lightroom, they get converted to DNG, and then when I start post-processing, I convert them to 16-bit TIFF files. So I hope that answers that question. What do I think of lens babies? I have a lens baby. I have a lens baby composer. I think they're awesome. They're extremely fun lenses to use. They're not actually that expensive. And what a lens baby, the closest effect that we have for lens baby, so if we take this image here and we bring it into FocalPoint, usually the easiest way to interpret a lens baby is by using a round focus buck. So let's reset everything here. We'll bring it round. We'll just put it over here. The main difference between what we can do here and what the lens baby can do is if we up the feathering, let's bring the feathering up to 100%. The lens baby almost gives the out of focus area somewhat of a radial or a motion blur, where this is more of a static blur. It's just kind of out of focus. There is no sense of motion. So that's primarily what a lens baby would do. I think in FocalPoint 1.0, the predecessor of this version, we actually had a lens baby look. And so what I did is I changed the version. I want to see how well this works. Bring the amount up. Yeah, so this is almost kind of, you can start seeing that the blur is getting some motion to it. And all I did was changed the version from 1 to 2. And what it does is it kind of gives a somewhat of a motion. I'm just bringing, you can see the motion slider over here. That will give you somewhat of a tilt shift or lens baby look. And I see someone said that they recommend I send my tilt shift lens to Canon for calibration. I actually did that. I sent all 3 of my lenses for calibration, and I still have a loss of sharpness. So it could be micro focusing that I'll need to do some micro adjustments, but it is a bummer. But still, if there's not a specific need for the tilt shift lens, I would just say save the money, buy another lens, get like a 200 f2, because those are beautiful lenses, and you know, do that. Granted, they're about $5,000, but let me go through a few more questions. Normally, I try to get someone to assist with the questions, but we're increasing the frequency of our webinars, and it's getting harder to secure someone. So I think part of the new format will be we'll go through some of the images, and then I'll spend a few minutes going through the questions module. Someone asked what would I use to brighten the tree. So let's go back really quickly, because that's actually a good kind of a quick. There are various things that you can do to brighten the tree. One of the easiest things to let's actually go to that image. All right, so this is the image, the original image, and we use FocalPoint to bring this out of focus. There are various things you can do. In Lightroom, you can use your adjustment brush, go to brightness, and you can do this in aperture as well. I can just boost the brightness a little bit. Sometimes I'll boost my brightness much higher than I want just to see where it's painting. And I can just draw onto the tree right here. I'm using a Wacom Intuos 4, which I love more than anything in the world. The nice thing about these adjustment brushes is, let's say I boosted the brightness here, and actually that's kind of a nice brightness level. Let me hide that dot. I can also start adjusting the other settings, and it'll only apply to where I painted. So I can boost the contrast of this, and I can boost the clarity. Now we're starting to see the tree really pop. I can actually make it a little bit brighter. So you can also use the exposure if you really want to kind of boost it in the brighter highlight areas of the tree. But you can see the difference. Here's the before, there's the after. So that's one of the ways. I also have I created a quick action in Photoshop to help with that as well, but Lightroom does a great job. So that's one of the ways that I would actually brighten the image. So let me see. I want to see if I can find one more question. I use Photoshop for pretty much. The question is whether I use Lightroom or Photoshop, mostly for post-processing. I hardly ever do. It's almost the opposite of the trend, I'd say, that I'm seeing. I hear so many people say now that I almost always never have to leave Lightroom, and that's true. Lightroom is very powerful, and it's getting more and more powerful. But for me, I personally love Photoshop. I love adjustment layers. I prefer accessing our onOne tools via Photoshop because once I'm done, I can start doing some adjustment layers in line. So I personally like Photoshop more for my processing. Um, Let me see here. Coming using a Wacom. There was a question of using a Wacom brush or a pen instead of using a mouse for the onOne tools. There, we built our products kind of to work specifically with Wacom. So if we bring an image into Photoshop, and to me, I can never get the control or the precision with my mouse. After I started using a tablet, and I've turned some of my friends onto tablets, and I hope to turn all you guys onto tablets. I'm not endorsed by Wacom. We're friendly with them, but I just think that their products are phenomenal. So much so that we did build it into our. If you go into Photo Tools, say, um, and you'll see we actually have specific controls. So we will recognize a Wacom tablet. If you see here, we've got Wacom controls brush size, Wacom controls opacity. The newer Intuoses are pressure sensitive to something like 2048 different levels of pressure. So the harder you press, the more opacity there is. Also, the harder you press or the lighter you press, it'll actually control. If we turn these on, let's just apply an effect really quickly. Let's apply brush. Let's brush lighter. Let's add that effect. Let's just see here. So as I start, you can see what I'm doing is I'm adjusting my pressure of my pen, and you can see how it's adjusting the size and the opacity. So the harder I press, the more opacity, and depending on how hard I actually press onto the surface, it'll adjust the size of the brush. So it's actually pretty cool. For me though, I never use them. You'll never see me with these on. I like adjusting my sliders. I have, to me, more precision. Where I don't have as much precision is just, as opposed to mouse, is just getting into very fine corners, as I do with just using, my 3 fingers to hold the pen. So I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent. Let me just see if there's focal. So basically, what will happen is someone is asking about my work order, um, the workflow order. And actually, we have a new webinar series starting in February where we're going to go through the whole entire workflow, starting with importing images into Lightroom. But in terms of these products, I'll import my images. If it's an HDR image, I'll tone map it, and then I'll send it into Photoshop. The first thing I do is I use FocalPoint, Photo Tools rather. I will get my effects down first, and then I'll use FocalPoint to isolate the focus. Because then I can see whether or not I want to increase or decrease the brightness and the contrast like I showed you. So I hope that helps there. And so let me see. Other than that, let's see, how do you get so fast from CS5 to Lightroom? I mean, I just close Photoshop and I'm in Lightroom is just in the background, and I can send my images to Photoshop just by right-clicking, going to Edit, and then edit in Photoshop CS5. And our products work from CS2 through CS5 in 32 and 64-bit. So I hope that helps there too. There's another question about workflow. I want to save the workflow questions for the webinars in February, but trust me, we will go through everything, or at least my workflow, and hopefully that'll give people ideas of how to kind of refine their own workflow, because you can have a whole entire college class on workflow theory. And that's one of my favorite conversations that I have with my various photography friends is just, what do they do? And we oftentimes share our ideas. That's why I love these webinars. I love photography in general because it's such a collaborative sport. So I hope that's helped. Um, Yep, the onOne plugins. The question is whether onOne plugins work as smart layers. Yeah, you can convert a layer to a smart layer and use it so that you can adjust it after the fact. That's actually a really good question, and I'm actually going to do a webinar that focuses around that as well down the line. So that's it. What kind of video card do I have? I have a Mac. The computer that I'm doing this webinar on, that I'm actually doing the work on, is a MacBook Pro. It's an i7 processor. I can't remember the speed of it, and it's got 8 gigs of RAM, so it's nice. And then my production machine is a Mac Pro dual quad core. I love talking geek talk, and it's got 16 gigs of RAM and way too much hard drive space. But if you're into HDR, you understand can appreciate that. Um, so that's it. I'm gonna start. I'd like to just actually I really enjoy these questions. If this is interesting you, then I'll be more than happy to entertain it right now. There was a question in terms of storage and backup. What do I do? So I have a standard Mac Pro, like I said, that I do my production work on, and I use a Drobo S as that actually holds all of my images. It's got about 6 terabytes of usable space on it, and then I just purchased after reading a backup strategy that my friend Jacob Lucas posted on his blog. I use a G-Tech RAID, or it's called a G-RAID drive. It's a 4 terabyte drive, and that is my offsite backup. So every 2 weeks, I back up my entire library to that external RAID drive, and my wife physically takes it out of the house. I don't use cloud backups. That stuff will take 46 months to back up all the photos I have. I don't trust them. I don't know if they're going to go out of business in a year from now and leave me stranded. This way, I control my offsite, and I recommend that for everyone. Even if you don't have a lot of images, even though you're backing up, which I do, locally I back up my Drobo to 2 separate external hard drives. I have a third, this RAID drive, that I back up that my wife takes offsite. If something happens, I know that I have, at least I'll lose only 2 weeks worth of work as opposed to, years. So that's basically it. And again, that's something I'll go over in that webinar as well, my workflow webinar. Um, so someone asked what do I use to develop my RAW. So I don't actually shoot RAW. All of my images, I shoot RAW, but when I import into Lightroom, I convert them to DNG. DNG is Adobe's kind of RAW format. It stands for digital negative. Um, it's there are two advantages, or so I've read, with digital negative files. One, let's say I do work. Let's say I do work in Lightroom right over here, and I want to share to you the raw file with the edits. If I use the raw file, so if I was Canon, it would be a CR2 file. If I was Nikon, it would be a NEF file. I'd have to give you the NEF file, plus I'd have to give you this sidecar file. The sidecar file is this little text file, a little XML file that has all the changes. If you didn't have the sidecar file, you wouldn't see my changes. The nice thing about DNG is it combines those two files into one file. So I don't have to give you a raw and a separate file. I can give you one file and you see the changes. Also, DNG is more economical with hard drive space. So it actually should be smaller in file size. It'll still be uncompressed. RAW is uncompressed. JPEG is compressed. So DNG has a nice kind of, it's a bit more economical, like I said, with file size. So I hope that helps as well. Um, What is Jacob's last name? His last name is Lucas, Lucas. He's a good friend of mine, and I strongly recommend checking out his website. Uh, I think it's jflphotography.com. I have no problems giving a shameless plug to my good mate from Australia. So that's and the reason why I want to plug it is because I there was a recent blog entry that he posted on his backup solutions, and I think everyone should have a backup solution, both an on-site and an off-site. Um, you want to have basically control no matter what happens, you don't lose your images. So um, here's a good question, and it's more HDR related. How do you get your DNG files into Photomatix? Photomatix supports DNG, so you can either send them directly to from Lightroom, and it'll convert it to TIFF. So, like I said, it comes into Lightroom as a DNG file, and then I will convert it to TIFF when I start working with Photomatix. So that's basically um, the workflow there. One DNG, TIFF, and that's it. I don't convert to anything else. When I convert for web, I'll convert to JPEG, like when images go on my blog. So that's yes. And actually, here's a very good question, Chris. Am I able to convert photos already loaded in Lightroom to DNG? Absolutely. You can convert raw files to DNG. It's only raw. You can't convert a JPEG to a DNG. It will take time. When that's one of the kind of downsides when you import and convert on the fly. It takes longer because it's physically converting these files. And I'm just going to try to see. I don't think it'll let me do it. Oh, here it is. Convert photos to DNG. So under library, you'll select your raw files and go to convert to DNG, and that'll do it for you. And I mean, I personally do recommend it. I have not found that there's a loss between a DNG or a CR2 file, Jay. I think that it's very much comparable. And I know Scott Kelby wrote about it. He uses DNG. I think he was the one actually that turned me onto it a while back. I've been converting to DNG for about 2.5 years now. So, um, and it's I've never been burned by it. The nice thing about DNG, if there is a way to kind of further sell it, DNG is Adobe standard, and Adobe has pledged that it will never change the standard. What I mean by that is, let's just say, and I'm being kind of melodramatic, let's say 15 years from now, Canon decides altogether to change their RAW format. It's no more CR2, or Nikon says we're not doing that, we're doing something else. And you have images from 15 years ago, from 2011, that are NEF or CR2, and you can't find a RAW encoder or a RAW decoder rather that can read it. You're kind of SOL. You can't view those images. Adobe has pledged that this DNG format will never change. So I liked having that kind of future-proof built in, and that's why I use DNG. There's a question about color space. I use ProPhoto for everything. When I export my images to the web, I convert to sRGB, and you can do that in Lightroom. When you import, you can control what your color space is, and if I want to say export an image here, I can control the color space. So sRGB for the web, ProPhoto just for myself. And everyone, please, if there's one thing that everyone should be doing when they export an image, regardless of whether you're printing or putting it on the web, you need to resharpen. Sharpening should be the very last thing that you do to your image. You should not sharpen and then edit some more. And so usually I'll do sharpen, and you can see here there are 3 different types. So for my blog, I'll have screen, and I'll do standard. I don't necessarily need high. It just adds a little bit more sharpness to compensate for the web browser or for printing, because when you print, you lose sharpness on the paper. So I strongly recommend doing that as well. So that's basically it. I actually really enjoyed this end part, and I'm going to start. It seems that you guys are enjoying it as well, and that makes me very, very warm in the heart on this very cold New England day. So what I what I'll do is, as we start um, doing more of these webinars, I would like to kind of do this question and answer module, and it could be pertaining to the subject of the webinar, or as long as you guys don't mind, and it's kind of hard, I'm going based on what I see here in the questions module. Um, as long as you guys don't mind, I'll field any questions that you have as long as I can answer them. If I can't answer them, I promise you I'll tell you that I don't know a fraction of anything. But what I do know, I will be more than happy to share. Um, Whenever there's a question with HDR, what ISO do I shoot at? 90% of the time I'm at ISO 100 with my Canon 5D Mark II. But if it's low light, or if at night, and I don't want to wait 4 or 5 minutes for the long side of my brackets, I'll bump it up to about 400. The 5D Mark II is remarkable with its high ISO noise handling. You can go up to 3200 and still have a nice usable image. So that's the answer there. And what I might actually do is you guys are really digging this. I think it's fantastic. I might just do a few webinars where it's just questions and answers we can go through. I might create a form where you guys can submit questions in advance, and we can go through and make it more of a dialogue. I really am enjoying this. So I'm glad you guys are enjoying this as well. This rocks. This rocks. Um, yeah, Jacques, my good man. The question is, do I find whether dark areas of photos come into Lightroom darker than in CS5? Yes. So I don't know the specifics of it, but when I work on images in Photoshop, especially HDR images, I work in Photoshop, I get into a place where I like it, and I have found that when I bring it back into Lightroom, the shadows are a bit muddier, they're a bit darker. I don't know why that is, but I do know that I'm hoping I could find an example here that hasn't been. Actually, they might have corrected this for Lightroom 3, but I want to say that in Lightroom 2, by default, the black was always at 5. And I think the reason why they did that was to give the impression, and it might be with RAW files, maybe with the JPEGs it's not working, but when you boost the black to 5, it gives the appearance, it gives your image a little bit of a nicer, more rich look to it right away. And I not 100%, but I think maybe in Lightroom 3 they reset blacks to 0, so they are as they are. I'm not sure though. I don't know what causes it though, but I definitely have seen. Just the other day I noticed it. I was working on an image and I brought it back into Lightroom and it was darker, and this concerned me. But I just kind of adjusted in the Lightroom to compensate, and that's the way it is. I can bring it up. I know the product manager at Adobe for Lightroom, so I can see if there's something else that I'm missing. It could be the camera. A few people are bringing up the camera calibration. So under the develop module in Lightroom, at least, they have this camera calibration, and they have various profiles. Now I use with Lightroom 3, they changed this process to 2010. And with JPEG, you're not going to really use camera profiles. This is something that you would use with RAW or DNG files or TIFF files that are uncompressed. I use a color checker passport made by X-Rite, and what the nice thing about that is it allows me to create a custom profile. And I hope I'm not kind of talking too geeky about it, but it allows me to create a profile where the colors are representative based on the lighting conditions of my scene. A lot of times, though, and to be totally honest, this is a moot point for me because I stylize most of my HDR images. So the color profile is almost irrelevant because I will change tone and color pretty drastically with a lot of my images. To that point, it's really depends on the scene, but I will always shoot a color checker passport reference shot for wherever I am. So let me see here. and some people are confirming that Lightroom is still bringing the black levels up a little bit, which is a bummer because it's definitely a faux effect. You should be starting at zero with everything. You should be the one stylizing your image, not Adobe. Um, so that's basically it. We've run overtime, and I apologize for that. I don't want to keep anyone later. We will do more of these for sure.